Personal delight to have with us today Siobhan Greene, who I have known for many years. In fact, I see my Brit in the audience also. We both met Siobhan when we were exercising, and she was our instructor many years ago. She's filled many roles around the peninsula, and right now I think she's at the top of her game as the executive director of CASA of Monterey County. CASA stands for Court-Appointed Special Advocates, and she will tell you a great deal more about what they do. She was originally the development director of CASA in 2002 and moved up to be executive director. I happened to be one of her volunteer advocates, and the reason I joined was because Siobhan just turned this organization around when she became executive director. Her marketing skills, her connections in the community, she just raised their profile hundreds and hundreds of % from what it had been. And I saw that an organization that well run would probably be rewarding to work with, as indeed it has been. Siobhan has extensive development and marketing background, years of clinical experience in mental health services, and is trained as a mediator. She's a board member for the statewide CASA organization, serves as the chair for the Juvenile Justice Commission for Monterey County, and is president of the Association of Fundraising Professionals for the Monterey Bay. She is also part of the local implementation team for the Blue Ribbon Commission on Children in Foster Care. I particularly asked her to tell us some general information about the foster care system in the county, because many of us are not all that familiar, and told her that the League does often focus on legislation, and so I think she'll mention a little about what's happening at the Sacramento level. So please join me in welcoming Siobhan Greene.
You know, it really is kind of entertaining when you look back on your life and all the different things you do. And I saw my Brit walk in and I thought, well, here we are. The class is about as ready to convene. One of the things I try to talk about with our advocates and with our kids that we work with is that if we can learn from all of the different experiences we have in life, it is really how we enrich ourselves and make ourselves more well-rounded. If somebody had told me 25 years ago, and I might have to add more years to that at this point, that I would have at one point in my life been teaching aerobics, I would have thought, nah. But I credit teaching aerobics with being able to actually stand up in front of you and speak to you and feel a little less anxious and nervous about that, which I certainly was for those who were there for those first few classes. I have been really honored to be working with CASA now since 2002. When I came to the organization, I knew nothing about it. I responded to an ad because I was working as a marketing director, and I felt that I really needed to do something more involved with the community and more involved with a nonprofit sector. I had worked in mental health for many, many years before I had my children, so I really saw firsthand a lot of the pain and the suffering and the loss that people have gone through in their lives, and that it's very important for us to be coming together in a way that helps to support those who need us so much. When I learned what CASA was about, I was really astounded. I found it to be one of the most remarkable concepts. So I'll share with you a little bit about the history of the organization so you have some framework, and a little bit about the dependency system in which we operate. I don't do that dependency system piece with every audience that I speak with, but given that you are the League of Women Voters and that you're here to look at the legislative issues and the really current events and issues going on for our communities and our state, I think it's important that you understand some of the framework that we work within. CASA was formed back in the 1970s by a judge in Seattle who was presiding over the dependency court and felt that he just simply did not have enough objective and adequate information about what was going on with the child. He was hearing from attorneys for the parents, he was hearing from social services, but he wasn't hearing from somebody who was there strictly to be the voice and the spokesperson for that child. He conceived this concept of having community volunteers trained in the system so they would understand how the system worked, and being able to then report back to him based on their interactions with the child and the parties to the case about what was going on with that child. And that really is the same way the program is structured to date. We are court-appointed special advocates, a very long name, tedious at times, and hard to understand sometimes. But what that means is that the judge presiding over the juvenile dependency court determines whether or not a child should have a CASA appointed to them. That judge will then appoint CASA in general, and our organization's responsibility is to select the CASA from our group of trained advocates who could be that right fit for that child. And we try very hard to make it a right fit. We don't do it arbitrarily. Kids in the foster care system get a lot of arbitrary stuff in their lives. They get assigned a social worker, they get assigned an attorney, they get assigned to a therapist, they get placed in homes, and there's not a whole lot of people saying, this is what this child needs, and I think I could really work well with this child. Or conversely saying, I don't think I'd be the best person to work with that child. One of the real important pieces of our appointment for children is that we make sure that we are pairing children directly with an advocate who has reviewed the case and understands it and believes that they can be a positive impact in their child's case and can take that case on effectively. We work with children in the foster care system, and the foster care system reports under the juvenile dependency courts in the county, throughout the state, throughout the country. That's how the system is set up. Interestingly, the dependency court concept was not even really a part of it until somewhere in the 1960s. Until the 1960s, the case was about the parent. And when that philosophical shift came, where they changed it to be the case is about the child, that's when the juvenile dependency courts came into play and came into being. And that is a really important philosophical difference and distinction. Because once we get to that place where we're saying the person who is of the utmost interest in this case, and that we have to be the most thoughtful about and have to make sure that we're the most responsive to is the child, that really shifts the perspective some. When it was thinking about the parents, well, yes, parents have rights and parents have needs, but the person that we should be most concerned with is the child. So that when the social services department goes in and finds circumstances that warrant removal of a child for their own safety and best interest, that case is then presented in a petition to the juvenile dependency courts. And the juvenile dependency courts determine whether or not they have enough evidence and enough substantiated documentation to have jurisdiction over that child. So there's the courts now having jurisdiction over that child and making decisions about that child's life. And isn't it a wonderful thing that in the 70s somebody conceived the notion that if the courts are going to be making decisions about a child's life and they're going to see that child once every 6 months or every 12 months at some points in time, that they should have feedback from people who are trained and who are objective and who are there to really ensure that the best interest of the child is what is the priority in the case. So that is the framework within which CASA works. Bev is one of our CASAs. Lisa is one of our CASAs. Nikki had been a CASA at one point. It is an amazing organization to see the wonderful people that come forward and volunteer and train. It's a huge commitment, and there are people that can do it for 6 months, there are people that can do it for 2 years. Whatever people can do and however they can really give their time to these children, they make an enormous difference. These 3 women that are in the room today, I have the deepest regard for because they donate their time and their energy, and that makes a huge difference. If you take anything away from my conversation with you today, I want you to take away the fact that the children in our community need all of us to be responsible for them and care for them. Do I need to repeat that? These are our kids. We need to take care of them. And it's a collective taking care of. You know, one of the things Bev got in my bio when I sent her my bio, I ran down a little bit of my own kids. And I said that, you know, my son was at college, my daughter was off in New York. And I said, and the dog isn't allowed to go away. And, you know, our connections to our children never end. And children in the foster care system who have not had stable, steady connections, they're looking for that in their lives. They're searching for that. And through many of our volunteers, we give them somebody who, even if they're no longer their volunteer advocate because the case is closed and the child is home, oftentimes there's still that sense of connection, that there was that person who really cared about me and really stayed with me when I needed to have that kind of support. Before I came here today, usually I get to these things a lot earlier so that I can kind of source out the room and this and that, but I got here really close to noon or a few minutes after because I was in court sending off a young girl that I have worked with for years. I think I met her when she was about 13, and I have not been her steady casa all along, but she has been in the foster care system, and everybody assumed she would be in long-term foster care, and that would be it. And Friday she turned 18, but a couple of months ago she went back to live with her father. This family had figured it out. They had done the work, and the road is not going to be, without its challenges ahead of them. But they had done the work, and she was going home to live with her dad. And this was such a moving court experience to watch, to hear the people who have been a part of this family's life and have seen this family, and they have a number of children, struggle tremendously and come to this day where people were saying, you made it back together. So that is one of our big underpinnings of our work, is that it's all about permanency. It's about helping these children have their permanency in their life, have family contact that isn't intermittent, have knowledge that there are people behind them. On the flip side of one of the sheets that you have there, there's a little outline, a little story that talks about CASA, but on the flip side it talks about permanency. And I'd like you to take a minute and take a look at it. Not necessarily right now. I'll let you read that. I gave you lots of reading material. You have a lot to do when you get home tonight. If you're in a book group, you might need to put it off for a couple of days because I've given you quite a bit of stuff to go over here. But permanency is a big part of what we do. So let me tell you how the advocates work and what their role is. An advocate goes through a very extensive training, extensive screening before somebody can become an advocate. And then when they're working directly with the child, their activities include meeting with the child, talking to the social worker, talking to the teacher, checking in with the therapist, checking in with the person with whom that child lives, whether it's a foster parent or a relative or a group home staff, and really having a good comprehensive picture of what's happening in that child's life. They're focusing on a few primary things. One is, of course, where are we in the process of permanency? Is this child going to be able to go back home to family? Are they going to be able to reunify? And if they're not going to be able to reunify, who are they going to know and consider as their permanent connections in their lives? They will be focusing on academic performance and how they are doing educationally. Children in the foster care system have historically had an abysmal experience educationally. I'm going to just give you a little visual exercise that I sometimes do physically, but I'm going to spare you that for today. So imagine each of you are a classroom, and you're each in a school, okay? And now you've had lunch together, you've been talking, and this and that. I take you, and I pick you up, and I put you over there. And now you're with a new school. And I take you, and I move you over there. And then I take you again, and I move you over there, and you're in a new school. When children change placements, which they do a lot in the foster care system, they also change schools a lot. And if you can imagine how disruptive that would be. I mean, if you were moved 3 or 4 times around this room, wouldn't you feel pretty disorganized and disjointed and not really able to connect even just socially to the group of people at the table, let alone academically? So one of the legislative pieces that came into play a number of years ago was AB 490. And AB 490 put a lot of measures in place to safeguard children in the foster care system. If you were to move from a foster home in Salinas to a foster home in Seaside, the child's rights are that they cannot be moved. They have the right to remain in their first school for the remainder of that school year. So if a child was living in Salinas, going to school in Salinas, and that was going well, but the placement was not, and they were shifted to live in a placement in Seaside, for example, the Seaside placement would be required by law to transport that child to the school in Salinas to maintain that kind of consistency. One of the other new laws that's on this spreadsheet that you have in front of you allows for children to receive partial credits for their work in school, because oftentimes if they're moved in midstream, because even though AB 490 said they shouldn't be moved, there are circumstances that warrant that. So they have made some provisions that children can earn separate partial credits and build up their credit base, because otherwise a lot of our kids weren't able to graduate because they simply didn't have the credits. The other thing, one of the newer laws that they're also looking at is having the graduation requirements be at the state level versus at the individual school, because as we know, different school districts have different requirements for graduation. So if a child is in school district A and pretty much on course to graduate with their requirements, but then gets moved to school district C and those requirements are different, then the child is out of luck. So what they're saying in that circumstance, rather than have to match school district C's graduation requirements, they would have to meet the state minimum requirements. That will give a lot of our kids a much greater advantage in remaining on track to graduate. And graduating high school is a hugely important factor. I'm going to read you a couple of statistics from, and these are a couple of years old, so I'm hopeful that they've improved a lot because they were really bad. But for children who emancipate from foster care at the age of 18, and that means they remain in foster care until 18 and they don't go back to live with family somewhere along the way. They exit foster care simply by the fact that they've had a birthday of 18, which is another issue that I'll touch on. Of those children, in the state of California, this is about 5 years ago, this data, so I think it's improved a little, but I wouldn't be so optimistic. 75% of the foster youth work below grade level, 54% complete high school, 25% are homeless, 30% are on welfare, 45% are unemployed. Less than 2% of emancipated foster youth matriculate onto four-year colleges, compared to 24% of the general population. And 32% of high school graduates in foster care are qualified to attend a college. Only 20% of African American and 16% of Hispanic foster children leave high school college ready. So we have a lot of work to do to help our kids get on track educationally. So one of the key responsibilities for a CASA advocate is to really be on top of what's happening academically for the child. They have the legal right to participate in conferences and in meetings and in discussions about their child's educational issues. And if the child is not living with a relative or somebody who has a long-term stability factor, it can be, the CASA advocate can be appointed as the holder of educational rights, so that they can actually have the educational decision-making power and authority for that child. And that, again, is a determination that's made by the courts, and it's based on who's available to provide due educational rights. The courts are kind of loath to take educational rights away from the parents. It's one of the last things they try to leave with the parents, because their hope is that if these children get reunified with those parents can really help and manage and assume that. And that's all well and good, except if a parent is not in the position to really understand the educational issues, that can be, again, parent-focused and not child-focused. And we need to make sure we're always conscious and shifting to child-focused. Social workers, group home staff are not legally allowed to hold educational rights. We have a child right now who was in a foster home. He's been moved to a group home in August. He's been in a group home. The former foster parent had educational rights because the idea at the time was that that child was going to stay there for a long haul. The child's been in a group home since August, and who has educational rights? So yesterday we submitted the paperwork to the courts to make sure that the advocate was given educational rights, because somebody has to have the educational rights over this child and make sure that the situations are monitored. Okay? The other issue I mentioned is children emancipating from the foster care system at the age of 18. It's so arbitrary. How many of you have had children in your lives turn 18? Okay, how ready were they to take on the world? They were totally confident, they were fine, they were ready to go, they were going to be breadwinners, they were done, right? They didn't need you at all, right? I don't think so. I don't think so. So why do we think that children in the foster care system are ready to be on their own and emancipated just because they had their 18th birthday? They aren't. So fortunately, several years ago, federal legislation called Fostering Connections was passed, which was great legislation that said in cases where it's necessary, foster care can be extended to the age of 24. And they passed that legislation, and then they said to the states, okay, now figure it out. Now you guys come up with a plan for how you're going to implement that and where you're going to find the money for it. and they gave some mandates about timing. So in January of 2012, the state of California is implementing what's called AB 12 and AB 212. And those are the state of California's responses to fostering connections. This will allow children to stay in the foster care system until it'll be a graduated process where they can stay in the foster care system until the age of 19, 20, 21, and they're going to be seeing how far out they can do this. It's a tremendous advantage to our children. It's a voluntary process. Children aren't going to be required to stay in foster care. If they're capable and they have connections and they want to move on with life, they can do that. But this is a voluntary process that's available to them. There's a lot of stipulations, there's a lot of requirements that the kids have to fulfill. And we as a system need to know how to be very responsive to these young people as well. Because if we go back to those 18-year-olds that we all knew weren't really necessarily really ready, we still had to shift how we parented them. We had to parent them in a way that respected their autonomy and that respected their decision-making power and taught them how to be more self-empowered and self-advocates. So as we roll out this AB 12, AB 212, our system has to also be responsive to the needs of these kids and make sure that we are giving these kids the tools to be self-advocates and to be empowered. We're talking about it from a perspective in Monterey County about having the kids themselves draft up the petitions to request to stay in the system, as opposed to the system, the social worker doing that. Now, we wouldn't do it without helping them, but what we're going to do is try to teach them how they can be their own advocate to make sure that they get their needs met. So AB 212 was sort of the fixer or the correction act to AB 12 because they realized that there were certain things that it was missing. So that's where AB 212 came in. And that's in some of this information. I pulled off of the California CASA Association does a really good job of monitoring all the legislation that's going on for kids in the foster care system. So these are on your tables there. We could be here for a couple of weeks if I was going to go over all the data in this information and go into it in great detail. But there are some really good descriptions of some of the bills that are coming forward. I want to highlight one or two that I think are really interesting. And I'm really lousy at remembering the numbers. AB 73. AB 73 talked about opening up the dependency courts to the public. And right now, the dependency processes are highly, highly confidential proceedings. These are proceedings that only the people who are involved in the case are allowed to even be in the room. As the director of CASA, I can get into a courtroom. But really, I shouldn't be. And I don't go in unless it's a case that I have some relationship to or we are looking at as a case that we should be doing. These are very, very private moments and very, very painful moments in people's lives. I mean, if you think about it, the kids that are in the system, they have been victims of abuses and neglect that none of us ever want to think about. You know, we don't want to really think that somebody would do that to a child. We don't want to think that somebody would hurt a child or not care for them and neglect them in such an egregious way. But can you imagine how that child feels? And would we want the public to know what those children are going through? The intent of the law has some merit, or the proposal has some merit, because they were suggesting it because they wanted greater transparency on the dependency system and that they felt would create greater accountability. So yes, under that piece of it, I can see some relevance for it. But our organization, our local CASA program is very much opposed to that legislation. We would not support it at all. We have seen the problems that happen with that. We had a case in Monterey County where there was really egregious sexual abuse on a young woman. And when the parents were charged with the crimes, and when they were eventually convicted of the crimes, the Monterey County Herald put it on the front page of the paper. And they mentioned the parents by name. And if they said, but we didn't mention the girls by name. Hello? Are you kidding me? You know? So I called Joe Livorno at the Herald, and I will give Joe great credit because he was completely responsive to my phone call. And I said, you can't do that. You can't put the names of the parents in the paper and not think that it's going to affect those girls. It said, we've got a couple of teenage girls right now who don't want to go to school. They don't want to leave the house. What were you thinking? So that's where I come from when I hear that they want to make the dependency proceedings open to the public, because I have great skepticism that the media will be able to keep their mouths shut and that people won't be in there looking at what's going on. So it worries me. It's currently been pulled because there was a lot of opposition. There's an organization in the state called California Youth Connection, CYC, and that's all former or current foster youth, and they came out in great opposition to that particular piece of legislation. So that, I think, was a big factor in how it got pulled. But it's likely to be revisited, it's likely to be brought back again, and I would encourage you to pay attention to it if you see it coming your way. Yes, maybe?
What would even be the purpose of having this?
Yeah. I mean, the purpose...
I don't know what the purpose would be.
Yeah. I think the purpose was that they would have more people able to see how the departments of social services were working and how the system was working and whether or not they were really doing what they said they were doing. Because, you know, the other flip side is we read these stories about, you know, the youngster who, remember, it was like about a year and a half, 2 years ago, the young kid who was in the system and like climbed over the fence and walked into a healthcare club out in the valley somewhere because he'd been so horribly abused and the system had lost track of him. So that's the kind of thing that they're trying to mitigate, is the system not being responsive and doing what it should be doing. So it's, again, that intent is good, but the process I question greatly. Any other questions? I'm talking actually like crazy. You can interrupt if you want. I'll give you a question and answer time, but you can also just interrupt if you want. Okay. Another one on this list that I think is really important is AB 181, and that talks about really empowering adolescents with mental health services, where they have a lot more say in their mental health services. And I just love this bill. I think it has a great deal of validity to it, that young people will have a chance to say, I'd like to interview the therapist I'm going to be working with. I'd like to talk to the person and see if this is going to work for me, and that they have a lot more control and a lot more say in it. So that's another really interesting one. There are, like I said, there's a lot of pages here, and I brought them for you. I'm happy to answer questions if you have them about them. I can't profess that I'm an expert on all of these, but we do try to keep abreast of them and know what's going on. I'm going to take a little breather so that you guys can ask some questions, because I would imagine you have some questions, and I could go off in tangents, and I don't want to do that to you. So what are your questions about how CASA works, or how the programs work, or any of those questions that you might have?
One of the things that you said that I thought was a little scary maybe was a huge commitment for a volunteer.
Right.
And I'd like you to elaborate on that a little, because I personally put in, I think, close to 300 hours over 2 and some years. It never felt like a huge commitment to me. It felt like an important commitment. But just give us an idea on an average, or just in your experience, how much time a CASA puts in so that people won't be scared.
That's a good point. Advocates can put in anywhere from 8 to 12 to 20 hours a month working on their case, and a lot of that really depends on what's going on. When a crisis hits, or it's a big school set of meetings because there's an IEP to be sorted through, there could be additional time. One of the things that's actually so interesting about CASA is that you have a great deal of control over the time you spend. So you can choose how often you see the child. We recommend that you see the child at least every other week. We don't recommend that you see the child every week or a couple of times a week, because kids need to be hanging out with kids. They don't need to be hanging out with all of us who are just a little older than them. They need to have us as good soundboards and reasonable and responsible adults in their lives, but they don't need to be spending all their time with us. We need to be monitoring that they're doing extracurricular and things like that. So anywhere between 8 to 20 hours a month, and 20 would be on the exceptional side, I think. What would you say, Lisa?
Yeah, I've been doing it, what, 6 years, and I don't know that I've ever even reached past 8 in the different cases. So,
but when I say the commitment is huge, I think I actually mean the one that you make in your heart. That's the one that's really big, because this is painful, difficult work. It's not going to be a walk in the park. It's not going to be easy all the time. And it's going to take somebody saying, I really am ready to make this kind of commitment to a child. It's important work. No one could do this work if they didn't believe in what they were doing and that they wanted to do this work. That just doesn't work at all. Kids can see through that in a hot second. We all know that. And then in terms of the length of a case, there are some elements of how the court proceedings go that show us that the average length of a case is somewhere between 12 to 18 months. Some cases go on for several years if the child's not going to be reunified at home, but that's sort of the average. The younger a child is, the shorter the length of time that the parents are given to follow a case plan and reunify with their children, because the courts are aware that time is a really sensitive issue to young children and they want to get those children home as quickly as possible. So there can be a case that's only open for 5 or 6 months. But we ask our advocates to make a commitment to the program once they go through the training and they get involved. We ask them to make a commitment for about 18 months. But if you also recall, I told you that when we are assigning you an individual child to work with, we have you look at cases and see what the difference is and see if one case would be better for you to work with or not. If you know that you can give to a child for 18 months, maybe 2 years, you're not going to take a child's case that looks like it's destined for long-term foster care and could be in the system for 3 or 4 or 5 years. You're just not going to, that's not going to be the appropriate assignment to you. So we look at all of those factors when people are taking their case. But we do try to invest a lot of training and resources into all of our advocates. And, for efficiency, we don't want you to come and go. But more importantly, we don't want you to come and go in those kids' lives because they've had too many revolving doors and they've had too many people in and out of their lives. And we want that advocate, once they come on that case, to be there. This case that I was in court for today, the attorney said, I feel like I'm letting my daughter go. I've known her for so long. And it was wonderful. And she sat there and she had tears in her eyes and she said, it's so nice to have all the people that have been part of my life for so many years here today to see me off and to see this moment in my life. Being consistent and committed to a child is the deepest part of that commitment. Other questions? Yes?
That IEP you mentioned, is that individual education program?
Yes, an IEP is an individualized educational plan.
Right.
And certain children have, some kids have certain academic needs that would necessitate something as an IEP. Not every child by any means has an IEP. It's only if you have certain learning needs, and I would actually defer to a number of the teachers in the room who could probably better define what circumstances lead to a child having an IEP. But you would be, if you had a child that had certain learning needs and certain learning issues, and schools and everybody determined that it was appropriate to have an IEP meeting, then the person who holds educational rights has to sign off on the IEP, that they approve it, and they agree with it, and they're ready to help implement it. Other questions? Yes?
You must have some problem sometimes convincing a child that this person is really caring about you, because they've gotten used to a social worker and a policeman and a legal person and so on, and here comes one more.
Oh, you bet. And I have heard from many a kid who said, when I first saw that person, I was like, oh, no, not another one in my life. And it's true, and they have every right to not trust us when they meet us. They have every right to look skeptically at this new person in their life and wonder, are you really going to be there for me? Are you really going to do what you say you're going to do? So that gets back to the commitment of the heart. And it gets back to being respectful and honest and genuine with a youngster. And knowing that that young person needs time to get to know you and to trust you and to believe that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. And then, by golly, you better do what you say you're going to do, you know? We try to teach our advocates not to promise the moon because we don't make promises that we can't keep. But if you say to a child, I'm going to call the school and find out what's going on with your credits that got messed up from the last school, and you don't do it, well then you've let that child down, and that's not okay. But a lot of our kids will tell you that it's taken them a while, and then they kind of reflect back and they laugh and they go, yeah, but she's not so bad, or he's not so bad. Yeah.
Can you explain to us
perplexed me is the notion that after parents have severely abused a child, or a couple of children in their home, that society really should try to put them back in the home. I mean, I just have a very difficult time with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think everybody has a difficult time with that because we can't really imagine that being fixed. So what has to happen is you have to have an understanding of what the circumstances were. I would venture to say that a lot of us in this room, if we had to walk in the shoes of some of the parents that we have worked with, we wouldn't do all that well either. That they have had a lot of loss and a lot of trauma in their lives as well. So if that is the circumstance and this person is amenable to intervention and they want to make a change, then there's the option and there's the hope that this will work. It doesn't always work. And there are a few cases where the abuse is so egregious that that step is indeed bypassed because it's just not going to work. But the hope is that people can fix their lives and can straighten things out and can get back on track. Again, if it's so egregious, and usually that involves serious criminal charges and so on, then sometimes that step is skipped. But the other thing we have to remember is that kids also really, really, really want their mom and dad to be the good people that they hope they are. You know, none of us give birth thinking that we're just not going to care about that person. Things happen. And kids love their parents for the most part. I think if we all were honest with ourselves, at some point in time, our parents were really not great. They didn't deliver. They weren't the nicest people on the planet. But even in that moment, most of us love our parents, and these kids are no different. So we have to try in every way we can to provide the kind of services to these families that allow them to heal and to improve on their parenting skills and to grow and to get back together again, if it's going to work. But if it's not going to work, we need to be open and frank about that as well.
Following up on that question, can you give a rough idea of what percentage of kids that go into the system get reunited and how many remain in long-term care?
I don't have the stats with me, but I can tell you that Monterey County actually does a fairly good job of reuniting children with their families. I would say we are probably in the 60-70 percentile on reunification. One of the things that we get dinged on, because the state looks at all the things you do, and one of the things the state dings Monterey County on is that they take longer to reunify children. But our pushback has been, but we're not having kids come back in the system. So if we invest a little bit more up front and help these parents up front more, and it takes a little longer, but the reunification is more successful and children are no longer in harm's way, then it's worth that extra bit of time. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, where does our money go?
Where does our money go? Our money goes to pay for social services. It goes to pay for group homes, for foster care, for varied levels of care. Interestingly, the comment about sending children back to their parents. My husband's a child psychiatrist, and he worked with a wonderful social worker many, many years ago up at UCSF. And she was quoted, and I use this line regularly as saying, the further we get children away from the family of origin, the more the state is willing to spend on them. When you think about it, a group home, which is really not a place where a kid should grow up, is far more expensive than a relative caregiver or a foster home even. So that's where the money goes, is to provide the services to these children and to provide services to the families and then to support the children. It's a complex system. But your state money and your government money, the plug, doesn't go to CASA. Just for clarification. I have one there and then you, Nikki. Yes.
What's the status of freeing up infants now for adoption in terms of foster care, and how long are they willing to work with a parent before they determine?
The absolute longest time they would give that parent would be 6 months. 6 months. Yeah. Nikki.
I was just going to say, in addition to what you were saying, it's something I observed, and even though my case
didn't go real well at the end. And the commitment Monterey County made to bringing families back together and giving them the services, therapy, et cetera, that needed to do that. And I was really impressed with that. They really do try hard to mend families, which is the best possible outcome.
And I appreciate you saying that, because I think it's easy for everybody to criticize the Department of Social Services and the system, because we hear about the bad stuff. But there really are amazingly good people that are working very, very hard on behalf of these kids. And, you know, every once in a while there's a bad foster parent, but that's not the norm, really. And no foster parent is getting rich on being a foster parent. That we can definitely erase out of our brains, because that just doesn't happen.
How much do you think being a foster parent now?
There's a whole scale of rates depending on how many children you have, depending on whether you have any special needs children, something like that. I want to say the bottom layer of payment is somewhere around $700 or $800 a month, something on that order. And then that's to provide all the needs that these children have. Yes?
Back to the nitty-gritty of being a volunteer again. I understand, of course, your main contact is going to be with this kid.
Mm-hmm.
Do you also have scheduled contact or something with the parents?
It really depends on the status of the case. If the child is in an active reunification and it's appropriate for the CASA to have contact with the family at that point, yes, you might. But your primary contact in the initial phase is with the child, and then it really changes as it goes forward. This family that reunified today, the grandmother said to me, had we not had a CASA in this child's life, I don't know if we would be here. So at that point, yeah, you're connecting with the family, but it really depends on the situation in the case. Yes?
How are foster parents chosen?
People apply. People apply to become a foster parent. They say this is something they'd like to do, and they send in applications, and they have interviews with the Department of Social Services, or you can go through foster family agencies like Kinship or Aspiranet. Those are privately, funded foster family agencies. And then if you meet the criteria and you pass all the background checks and live scans and all of that, then they put you through training, and you have to be trained as a foster parent. CASA's training to be an advocate is longer than what they do to train for foster parents. What is the training? We're a 40-hour training program, and we cover everything from child development to educational issues to how the court system works, to personal boundaries and how to be a good CASA and maintain your boundaries and not lose yourself in that process. So it's the biggest commitment is that upfront training to be an advocate, because it's intense. And our next training starts in the end of October. Before people come into training, we meet with them for an individual interview, and we warn everybody right up front that this is not a job interview, so we ask all sorts of questions that you would never get asked in a job interview, because what we want to assess is whether or not this is right for you, as well as whether or not it's right for the child.
Is the training in the evening?
Most of the training's in the evenings. What we've got right now, our October training, which will be, I think it's like the 25th, is that a Tuesday? If that's a Tuesday, that's the day it starts. So it'll be a Tuesday, Thursday night, and then Saturdays, and it'll wrap up before Thanksgiving. And so Saturdays would be 9 to 4, and you'd have 2 segments on a Saturday. Yes?
How often throughout the year do you offer the training?
We do it at least 4 times a year. So we just finished one in September, and now we're doing another one for the holidays, and then we'll take a little break and we'll bring it back up. We'll start training again in January or so. And we've been really trying to push our advocates this year. We've had as high as 70-something children on our wait list, which is just, it's terrible for me. It's a number I don't want to see. And when the courts say we want you to have an advocate for this child, I want to have an advocate for that child. So we are actively recruiting for volunteers, so if anybody's interested, you just let me know. Yes?
What percentage of the children who are in foster care get a CASA?
There are about, I would say we're at about 2/3 of the kids in foster care are appointed to CASA in our county, because we have about a little over 300-something children in the system, and we have had upwards of 200-something children in our caseload. So it varies. Statewide, it's much different. The statistics statewide get very skewed because LA County has an
enormous amount of children in foster care. So if you look at the numbers statewide aggregate, it's far less than it is in Monterey County. Yes.
I'm going to make a facetious remark,
Go ahead.
which everybody in this group who knows me understands.
I got you.
Okay.
I'm ready.
Does the state of Minnesota have a CASA system for people like Michelle Bachman? 21.
Apparently there's one that slid through the cracks. I love a group like you. I got it. Yes.
Do the volunteers meet each month to kind of talk about their case?
We have all sorts of different ways for that to happen. Each volunteer is assigned a direct supervisor, and that person is there to guide them through their casework. So you can, ideally, you're connecting with your supervisor on a one-to-one basis, on a monthly basis. But then we also have continuing ed workshops throughout the year, and advocates are expected to do 12 hours of continuing ed, so we bring in topics that are case relevant for you so that you're getting more education and training as you go along. And then we also have something that we call peer review, which is the more informal structure where a group of advocates come with a staff person or sometimes an outside therapist and discuss and process the cases and try to understand what's going on with their case and see if there's some, oftentimes that's a good place to find out where somebody goes, oh, well, I've been through that. Let me tell you how I did that. And so there's a good network of support if people take full advantage of all the things that are offered. Yes.
Does the child have some input into their CASA volunteer?
Not necessarily, but we have had children say, I don't like my CASA. And when somebody says, I don't like my CASA, we take it very seriously and we look at what we can do. And when that has happened a few times, we have said, okay, let's see what we can find a different person for you. What are you looking for? How does it work? Our staff will meet with the children when they're pointed to us so that they get a little insight into what that child might want, what they're looking for. They want to have face-to-face with that child to check out their needs and their issues so that when we're trying to pair that child with an advocate, we have something to go on. So it's not just reading the report. If you read the report, if that's the only way you find out information on the children, oh God, it's terrible. It's just negative as can be. I've got a lot of hands. Let's go right back here and then right here.
How big is your staff and what kind of training do they have?
We currently have 7 full-time people and 3 part-time people. One of our staff has his master's in a number of different elements of therapy and psychology. We have a social worker or somebody who has their MSW in social work and criminal justice. We have a couple of people who have come up through the ranks who are probably the most intuitive people on the planet, and they are incredible supervisors. Our program manager has her background actually working in a CASA program as a director of a CASA program in Siskiyou County and served as an advocate supervisor in Santa Cruz and worked in inpatient mental health. So she comes with a great deal of background too. We try very hard to find staff who we feel have a good balance of understanding of what it's like to be an advocate and understanding that process with the clinical background and training that's necessary to really understand the dynamics of the children and their families. And all of our staff are required at some point in time to serve as an advocate because we believe walking the walk and doing it really teaches you a lot about how to interface with the system. Yes.
What's the percentage of men to women in the volunteer ranks?
It's about 75-25, which is a problem. Because our children's pretty much balance out to about 50-50 boys and girls. Almost at any time we ever look at the numbers, it's kind of remarkable. So we're really usually heavily recruiting for men as well. But that doesn't mean all of your problem. Because we'll stick with the skewed percentage as long as we get good people in there. So you can go home and tell any man that you know that retarded back there. Yes.
How many children does an advocate work with?
Typically an advocate works with one child. But there are sometimes when a child is part of a sibling group and it might be a little disruptive to have too many siblings, too many advocates working with a sibling group. We had at one point a group of 7 children.
Well, if we had 7 advocates in that would be chaos. So what we had was like 3 advocates, and they would co-CASA and communicate together and try to get those kids together. Lisa, you've worked with more than one child concurrently that weren't siblings, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I
did that as one was winding down and I wasn't needed as much. And so then I took on another one, and so that worked out just fine.
Yeah, that worked out great.
Yeah.
Yes, any other questions?
I just wanted to volunteer something about the supervisors. I have had extraordinary support at the with the CASA staff, and particularly my supervisor. She knows my child. She's always at court. She has input for me sometimes from other sources. She seems to be totally plugged into the case that I'm working on, and that is extraordinarily helpful and supportive. So she supports and helps, and I don't know how I would have done it without her.
I have a really wonderful team of people that work for me. I am very, very, very fortunate to have the kind of people that I have work for me. They are just tremendous, all of them. But also in that sense, one of the other things that we try to do in our office is we have a kitchen in our office. It's a really, really beautiful kitchen that was donated almost exclusively by different vendors throughout the county, organized by Jillian Clark over at the kitchen studio. And the reason we have that isn't just so that the staff can have a nice place to have lunch. It's really to get the advocates and the kids to come in and use the kitchen and use the space, because we want our kids to come into the office and see that CASA is more than just the person that they work with, that there's a bigger element of support behind them. It gives the kids a sense of greater support in a different way, and it also provides us with some sense of protection. We want to see firsthand how an advocate and a child are interacting together. We want to get a sense of how that relationship is working, and unless you see them face to face, you're not going to have that. And not as many programs as I would like to see in the state really push that piece of it. And I'm very serious about it, because I really don't want our children to feel like they're out there. If it is a bad relationship with their advocate and they don't get along and it's not working, I want them to know that there's a place that they can go to and talk to somebody and get that support so that they're honored in their needs. Yes?
Where are most of the children located?
I would say a large portion of our kids are in Salinas Valley, Marina, Seaside. Not as much on the peninsula, and one of the other elements of that commitment to being an advocate is that you have to be willing to travel to be with your child, and kids do get moved. So you can have a very convenient situation where a kid lives pretty close, and then they could get moved, and that doesn't mean you go, I don't think so. That means you get in the car and you drive. Mm-hmm.
How would a CASA volunteer be able to take a child in their car?
In their car, yes. In their home, no. So all of our volunteers are required to present proof of auto insurance and valid driver's license, and part of our background checks that we do are DMV reports. So we get reports on all our advocates on a consistent basis. So if somebody, has, a red light, I'm not so concerned about it. But if we get a report that somebody has a DUI, that's a whole different story. So, anything else? You guys have been great. It's been really lovely to speak to you. And I really commend you for wanting to hear about programs that work with kids who are abused kids, because it's really hard sometimes in this community to get everybody to see beyond the beauty of our community and how lovely and how rich it is here, and to remember that there are children that are suffering quite badly, and that we as a community. What was your takeaway here?
We care about our children.
They're all our children. Okay, thank you all so much. And if anybody wants to come to the lunch, there's a flyer on the table. Thank you.